The shop closed on a Tuesday. I know that because I walked past it on the Wednesday and the shutter was down, and there was a single sheet of paper taped to it at eye height with 4 lines of handwriting on it. I could read enough by then to get the gist. Thank you for many years. We are closing. Please take care of yourselves. He had repaired small electrical things, rice cookers, fans, kettles, the motor in a sewing machine. He was somewhere past 70, and he had been in that unit since before I was born, and I had been in there maybe 8 times in 4 years, which in hindsight is part of the story. 2 doors down, on the same street, there was a 100-yen shop. And in that shop, on a shelf at knee height, you could buy a kettle. Not a good kettle. A kettle. It cost less than the bus fare to get to his shop and back, and it worked. And when it stopped working in 14 months, you would buy another one. And the arithmetic of that had already ended his trade about 15 years before he finally admitted it. I want to tell you the story of how that happened, because it is not the story you have been sold. You have probably encountered the Japanese version of this subject in its export form. Mending as philosophy. Gold in the cracks of a broken bowl. A word that supposedly captures a national reverence for objects, printed on tote bags. It is a beautiful story, and I have watched people build entire personal aesthetics on it. The actual history is stranger, sadder, and considerably more useful, because it is a story about a country that repaired everything, stopped almost completely inside 2 generations, and is now, quietly, for unglamorous reasons, starting to do it again. And the thing that decided every stage of it was not values. It was arithmetic. I spent 4 years in Japan learning a trade. I arrived believing what most Westerners believe about Japanese attitudes to objects, and I left understanding that I had been shown a museum and told it was a country. Let me take you back to where it starts. 1945. The war is over, and the country is physically destroyed. 60-odd cities have been burned. Housing stock in the major cities is largely gone. There is not enough food, and there is not enough of anything else either. In that Japan, nothing whatsoever gets thrown away, and I want to be precise about why, because this is the hinge of the entire story. It is not because of a philosophy. It is because there is nothing to replace anything with. Clothing is remade out of military surplus and out of other clothing. Metal is collected and reused. A cooking pot is a serious possession. There is a thriving trade in things Westerners would not consider things. An empty tin, a length of wire, a piece of usable timber out of a ruin. The word people now put on tote bags exists in this period, and it means something closer to what a grandmother says when you leave rice in the bowl. It is a rebuke about waste in a context where waste is genuinely dangerous. It is not a design principle. It is the vocabulary of scarcity. The people I trained under were the children of this, not the participants, the children who grew up in houses run by people who had lived it and who absorbed the habits without ever having faced the conditions that produced them. That distinction matters enormously later. There is a detail from this period that I only understood after somebody explained it to me twice. The repair trades of the late 1940s were not staffed by people who had trained as repairers. They were staffed by people who had been trained by the war. Radio operators, aircraft mechanics, machinists from the munitions plants, men who came back with an extremely specific technical education and no industry left to apply it to. So the golden age of Japanese repair, the one the whole export story rests on, was partly an accident of demobilization. A generation of people who could fix machines was released into a country full of broken machines, at the exact moment when nothing new could be bought. That is an astonishingly favorable set of conditions, and it lasted about 15 years, and no amount of national character would have produced it on its own. Now, move forward 10 years, because this is where it turns. The mid-1950s to the early 1970s is the high-growth period, and the economy expands at rates that had essentially never been seen before. Wages rise year on year, and an entire population that has spent a decade owning almost nothing is suddenly able to buy things. There is a phrase from this period that tells you everything. 3 household items were referred to, half-jokingly, as the 3 sacred treasures. The term for the imperial regalia? A black and white television, a washing machine, and a refrigerator. Those 3 objects were the national ambition. Owning them was what it meant to have arrived. And when a colored television arrives, and a car arrives, and an air conditioner arrives, the list gets rewritten with the new items on it. And the previous items, the ones that were sacred 10 years ago, become the ordinary things you replace. I want you to notice what has happened here, because it happens quietly. In 1948, replacing a working object was unthinkable because you could not. In 1968, replacing a working object is the visible proof that your life is improving. The same action has switched moral sign completely, and nobody decided this. It is just what a rising wage does to a household. Repair still exists all through this period. The repair shops are everywhere, and they are busy. But something has changed underneath them. And it is that repair is no longer the default and the automatic. It is now one option among 2. And once there are 2 options, they compete on price. There is one more thing about the high-growth years that shaped everything downstream, and it is about who was doing the buying. These were not replacement purchases. Nobody was upgrading a washing machine. They were getting a washing machine for the first time, in a household that had washed clothes by hand for 1,000 years. Which means the whole retail apparatus of the country got built around first-time buyers. The advertising, the finance, the shop layouts, the salespeople, all of it was designed for the moment a household acquires a category rather than the moment it renews one. An economy configured for first purchases does not develop good instincts about second ones. And when the country ran out of first purchases, sometime in the 70s, that machine did not stop. It just started manufacturing reasons to buy the same category again. The 1980s is where it goes fully over. By the mid-80s, Japan is extraordinarily rich and, for a period at the end of the decade, briefly experiencing one of the largest asset bubbles in economic history. Land in central Tokyo reaches valuations that are difficult to describe without sounding like exaggeration. The mood of the period is preserved in the advertising, and the advertising of that era is not subtle. Consumption is presented as a virtue. Buying is the thing that patriotic, successful, modern people do. There is a slogan from this period that translates roughly as, "Consumption is a virtue," and it was not being said ironically. And there is a structural feature of the Japanese economy that pours petrol on all of this, and which almost nobody outside the country knows about. Japanese houses lose their value, not slowly. A wooden house in Japan is typically treated as having depreciated to approximately nothing within a few decades. When a property changes hands, the value is very often in the land alone, and the building is a liability to be demolished. Average building lifespans are dramatically shorter than in the United States or Britain, and this is normal, expected, and priced in. Think about what that does to the incentive to maintain anything. If a house you repair well is worth no more in 30 years than a house you neglect, the entire logic of maintenance collapses at the level of the largest object a family owns. And the attitude does not stay contained inside the house. A country where the buildings are disposable is going to be a country where the kettle is disposable, because the mental model has already been established at the top of the scale. That is one of the 2 things that killed the repair economy. Here is the other. The 1990s. The bubble has burst. The economy is in what will end up being called the lost decades. And household spending is under pressure for the first time in 40 years. And into that arrives the 100 yen shop. The format existed before, but this is when it takes over. Enormous chains, thousands of stores, essentially everything a household needs at a single flat, trivial price. Kitchenware, tools, stationery, storage, cleaning equipment, small electricals just above the flat price. Here is what that does. And it is not a moral event. It is a mathematical one. A repair has a floor cost. The person doing it has to eat. Even a trivial repair involves a person's attention for 20 minutes. And 20 minutes of a skilled person's time has a price that cannot go below a certain number. When the replacement costs less than that floor, repair does not become unfashionable. It becomes impossible. There is no attitude adjustment available that fixes this. You can love objects with your whole heart and you will still not pay 2,000 yen to repair a 100 yen item, and neither will anybody else. And the shop that used to do that repair will close. That is what killed the trade. Not spiritual decline. A price line crossing another price line in about 1995 and never crossing back. There is a second-order effect of the 100 yen shop that took longer to show up and did more damage than the price itself. It changed what people expect an object to be. If most of the small things in your house cost 100 yen, you stop developing any sense of what a well-made version of that thing feels like. A good pair of scissors is not obviously worth 30 times a bad pair to somebody who has only ever held the bad pair. The knowledge required to want the better object quietly disappears. And once that knowledge is gone, the market for the better object shrinks, which means fewer are made, which means fewer people encounter one, which means the knowledge shrinks further. That loop ran for about 20 years, and the shops that closed were not only losing on price, they were losing customers who no longer had any way to tell what they were buying. Now the third blow, which is slower and which is still happening. The people who do skilled repair and traditional craft in Japan are old. The traditional crafts sector has a well-documented and openly discussed succession problem. The number of people working in designated traditional crafts has fallen enormously from its peak. The workshops that remain are frequently run by people well past normal retirement age. And the central difficulty is not that young people refuse to learn. It is that the training is long, the pay during training is poor, and the business at the end of it does not reliably support a family. I saw this directly. In the trade I was in, the question of who would take over was live, constant, and unresolved. And it was discussed in exactly the flat, unsentimental way you would discuss a machine that was going to fail. A repair trade is not knowledge written in a book. It is knowledge held in the hands of specific living people, and it transmits by one person standing next to another person for years. Break that chain once, and it does not come back. Because the person who could have taught it is dead, and the person who would have learned it became an accountant. So, by roughly 2005, you have a country where the economics of repair are dead. The incentive to maintain a building is dead. The skilled trades are aging out with no successors. And 2 full generations have grown up in an environment where replacing things is simply what one does. There is a specific mechanism to that failure that is worth naming, because it is the same in every country and almost nobody plans for it. An apprenticeship is a transfer that requires both people to be alive, willing, and in the same room for years. There is no other channel. You cannot write it down adequately. You cannot film it adequately. And the parts that matter most are precisely the parts nobody can articulate. How much pressure when it feels wrong, what the sound means. which means the knowledge has a shelf life measured in one human lifetime, always, with no exceptions and no backup. Every other kind of institutional knowledge degrades gradually. This kind does not degrade at all and then vanishes completely on a specific afternoon when one particular person dies. And that is the exact moment the word goes global. This is the part of the story I find genuinely remarkable, and it is the reason I wanted to make this video rather than another one. In 2005, a Kenyan environmentalist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate came to Japan, encountered this word, and decided it was the most useful concept she had come across for the environmental movement. She took it to the United Nations. She used it in speeches internationally. She built a campaign around it. And Japan discovered its own word had become globally famous, largely because a woman from Nairobi had found it more compelling than the Japanese public currently did. I want to sit on that for a second, because the irony is genuinely load-bearing and not just a nice line. The concept was exported to the world as ancient Japanese wisdom about the value of objects, at almost precisely the historical moment when Japan had the weakest possible claim to be practicing it. The country was demolishing its houses on a 30-year cycle and buying its kitchenware at 100 yen apiece. Then it came back in, re-imported, as a brand. It appears in government campaigns. It appears in marketing. It became something Japan is known for at the point where it had mostly stopped doing it. And the same thing happened, in a smaller way, with the gold-repaired pottery. The Western version of that practice is presented as a philosophy of embracing damage. And it is genuinely a real technique with real history. But in Japan, it is largely a specialist restoration trade for valuable ceramics and, increasingly, a workshop you can book as a tourist. Nobody was gold repairing their everyday rice bowl. The everyday rice bowl was from the 100-yen shop, and when it broke, it went in the bin, like yours does. So if you have been carrying around a picture of a country that reveres its objects, that is the museum I mentioned, it is real, it is in there, and it is not how the country actually lives. There is a smaller irony inside the big one that I think about more often, because it is the one with a lesson in it. The English language version of this concept is almost entirely about feelings. Reverence, mindfulness, gratitude towards objects, a relationship with your possessions. The Japanese version I actually lived with was about none of that. It was flat, practical, and slightly irritable. Do not waste that. Use it up. Why did you buy a new one when the old one worked? The export process took a piece of household arithmetic and translated it as spirituality, which is exactly backwards. And it matters because the arithmetic is transferable and the spirituality is not. You cannot import somebody else's reverence. You can absolutely import somebody else's habit of asking what a thing costs to keep. Now the rebuild, because this story does not end at the shutter. Something genuinely changed in the last 10 to 15 years, and it did not change because of a values campaign. The second-hand market in Japan is now enormous. There are national chains that buy and resell used books, clothes, appliances, and instruments, and they are on ordinary high streets rather than in charity shop back alleys. A smartphone app for person-to-person resale became one of the country's most successful consumer businesses of the last decade, and is used at a scale that would have been unthinkable in 1990. That matters more than it sounds, because it changes the arithmetic again. If an object has a resale value, keeping it in good condition pays. Suddenly, there is a financial reason to look after the thing, take care of the box, keep it clean, and not break it. And that reason works on people who have no interest whatsoever in a philosophy of objects. The young generation buys used at rates their parents would have found faintly shameful. That is not spiritual. It is that wages have been broadly flat for a very long time, and a used item is cheaper. Repair is coming back through the same door. not the old repair shop. That model is gone. But there are repair cafes, community sessions, and manufacturers who have discovered that a repair service is a way to justify a higher price for the original object. And this is the actual lesson, so let me state it plainly. Every stage of this 100-year story was decided by which option was cheaper. Repair won in 1948 because replacement was impossible. Replacement won in 1968 because incomes were rising. Replacement won decisively in 1995 because a mass-manufactured item cost less than 20 minutes of a person's attention. And repair is edging back now because resale gives an object a residual value and because incomes have not risen for a long time. At no point in that sequence did the Japanese people change their minds about whether objects deserve respect. The prices moved and the behavior followed, which means every conversation about this that is framed as a moral one is aimed at the wrong target. Telling people to value their possessions more does very little. Changing what it costs to repair a thing does everything. That is why the interesting action right now is legislative rather than spiritual. The arguments in Europe and the United States about whether a manufacturer must supply parts, publish manuals, and stop gluing devices shut are, in the most literal sense, arguments about where that price line sits. Move the line and the behavior moves. That has been true in Japan for 80 years, and it is true where you are. There is a counter-argument to all of this that I should put properly, because the cheap replacement story is not purely a loss. A 100-yen shop puts a functioning kitchen within reach of somebody who genuinely could not otherwise afford one. A cheap kettle is a real improvement in the life of a person on a low income. And the era when everything was repaired was also the era when a household owned 4 objects and boiled water on a fire. Anybody telling you the disposable economy is simply a decline is describing it from a position where the alternative was affordable. That has not been true for most people for most of history. So the honest version is that the country traded a repair culture for a level of material comfort that was previously impossible, and that most of the people who made that trade would make it again. What is worth recovering is not the poverty, it is the specific thing that got thrown out alongside it. So what do you actually do with this? 3 things, and the first one is a change of frame rather than an action. Stop treating your own replace versus repair decisions as tests of character. They are price comparisons, and you will lose most of them. And losing them does not make you a worse person than the man with the shutter. Second, and this is the one worth acting on, the resale point is the strongest lever available to an individual. Look after the things that hold value and stop worrying about the things that do not. Keep the box, keep the receipt, clean it, and treat the resale price as the real return on maintenance. That works on your actual incentives rather than against them. Third, when you do buy, the question that predicts everything is not whether the object is well made. It is whether parts exist. An excellent device with no available parts has a fixed lifespan that has already been set for you by somebody else. A mediocre one with a parts catalog can be kept alive indefinitely. That single question, can I get parts, separates objects that are yours from objects you are renting until they fail. I went back down that street on my last week in the country. The unit had been relet. It was selling phone accessories. I do not want to make it sadder than it was. He was past 70. His children had jobs, and he had run a business for 4 decades in a trade that stopped existing underneath him, which is a thing that has happened to a lot of people in a lot of countries and is not uniquely tragic. but I think about the 8 times. 4 years living 200 meters away, and I went in 8 times. And every one of those visits was because something had broken that I could not replace easily. Not because I had chosen him over a shop. I was not a customer. I was a fallback. And a trade cannot survive on being the fallback. Which is the whole thing in one sentence. If this was useful, there is a video on this channel about the 9 things Japanese people do with clothes that make them last 20 years. Which is the household scale version of everything I have just described, and which is still genuinely practiced, unlike most of what gets exported. Watch that one next.